The vast Nevada desert stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harrison estate, its golden dunes shimmering under the relentless sun. Marcus Harrison sat motionless in his custom wheelchair, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the horizon where heat waves danced like ghosts across the sand. At 38, he was a man who had once commanded boardrooms and conquered mountains, but now found himself prisoner to both his paralyzed legs and the suffocating silence of his mansion. 3 years had passed since the accident that changed everything. 3 years since he traded his corner office in downtown Las Vegas for this isolated sanctuary, 50 miles from civilization. The mansion, worth $12 million, boasted every luxury money could buy. Marble floors imported from Italy, a wine cellar stocked with the world's finest vintages, and technology that responded to his every voice command. Yet none of it could fill the void that had consumed him since that fateful night when everything went wrong. Marcus pressed a button on his wheelchair's armrest, and the massive windows tinted darker against the desert glare. The silence pressed against him like a physical weight, broken only by the gentle hum of the air conditioning system working overtime against the Nevada heat. His housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, had left hours ago, as she did every evening at 6, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the ghosts of his former life. The meteorologists on the morning news had mentioned something unusual, an unprecedented weather system moving across the southwest. Marcus had dismissed it as sensationalized reporting until he noticed the strange clouds gathering on the horizon. They were darker than anything he'd seen in his 3 years of desert exile, heavy with an ominous promise that seemed impossible in this arid landscape. As if summoned by his thoughts, the first snowflake drifted past his window. Marcus stared in disbelief. Snow in the Nevada desert was rarer than discovering water on Mars. He'd lived in this region long enough to know that temperatures rarely dropped below 50 degrees, even in the depths of winter. Yet there it was, another flake, then another, each one catching the fading sunlight like tiny crystals falling from an alien sky. Within minutes, what had begun as a curious anomaly transformed into something far more dramatic. The snow began falling with increasing intensity, coating the red sand in a blanket of pristine white that seemed to erase the familiar landscape entirely. Marcus found himself captivated, despite his usual indifference to the world beyond his walls. There was something almost mystical about watching the desert transform before his eyes, as if nature itself was rewriting the rules he thought he understood. His phone buzzed with weather alerts and news notifications. Historic blizzard conditions. One headline read, "Unprecedented snowfall across southern Nevada." Marcus scrolled through the messages with growing fascination. The storm was being called a once-in-a-century event, with meteorologists struggling to explain how such extreme weather had developed so rapidly in a region known for its perpetual drought. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just as his own life had been transformed in an instant, the desert was experiencing its own impossible metamorphosis. The parallel struck him with unexpected force. Here was a landscape as barren and unchanged as his own existence, suddenly blooming with something miraculous and strange. As the evening deepened, the snow continued to fall with relentless determination. The wind picked up, howling across the dunes with a ferocity that made the mansion's reinforced windows shudder. Marcus had never experienced anything like it in his years of desert solitude. The storm seemed to possess a life of its own, as if the desert was finally demanding attention after decades of being taken for granted. From his position near the window, Marcus could see his estate's security lights struggling against the swirling snow. The usually crisp beams were now diffused into soft halos, barely penetrating the white curtain that had descended over his world. The sight filled him with an unexpected sense of unease, not fear of the storm itself, but recognition of how vulnerable even his fortress of wealth and technology could become when nature decided to flex its muscles. The storm's intensity continued to build throughout the night. What had started as an extraordinary curiosity was rapidly becoming something far more serious. The Weather Service was now issuing dire warnings about life-threatening conditions, urging all residents to remain indoors and avoid travel at all costs. Roads were becoming impassable, power lines were failing under the weight of accumulated snow, and rescue services were suspending operations until conditions improved. Marcus found himself drawn repeatedly to the windows, watching the familiar landmarks of his exile disappearing beneath the accumulating snow. The rocky outcropping where he sometimes went to sit and remember better times was now just another white mound in an increasingly featureless landscape. The paved road that connected his estate to the outside world had vanished entirely, leaving no trace of the thin lifeline that linked him to civilization. For the first time in months, Marcus felt something other than the numbing emptiness that had become his constant companion. The storm had awakened something in him, not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin, curiosity. He was witnessing something extraordinary, something that defied explanation and demanded attention. The desert, like himself, was experiencing the impossible. As midnight approached, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be gaining strength, transforming the familiar desert into an alien landscape that bore no resemblance to the world he knew. The snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes that stuck to everything they touched, building drifts against the mansion's walls and obscuring the carefully maintained landscaping that had cost him a fortune to install in this hostile environment. Marcus positioned his wheelchair closer to the window and dimmed the interior lights to better see outside. The storm was beautiful in its fury, a display of raw power that reminded him of the forces he'd once thought he could control. Before the accident, he'd been a man who bent the world to his will through sheer determination and unlimited resources. Now, watching nature rewrite the rules with casual indifference to human plans and expectations, he felt both humbled and strangely energized. The secure phone system in his study had been ringing intermittently throughout the evening. Probably his assistant checking on his welfare, or perhaps his brother calling from Seattle with concerns about the news reports. Marcus had ignored them all, preferring to experience this unprecedented event in solitude. There would be time later for explanations and reassurances. Tonight belonged to the storm and whatever revelations it might bring. Little did Marcus know that 50 miles away, two young women were fighting for their lives against the same merciless blizzard that had captured his fascination. Sisters named Sarah and Emma Mitchell, fleeing from a past that haunted their every step, had become lost in the desert just as the storm reached its full fury. Their old sedan had finally surrendered to the impossible conditions, leaving them stranded in a landscape that offered no shelter and no mercy. But Marcus remained unaware of their desperate situation, still mesmerized by the transformation unfolding outside his windows, still contemplating the strange parallel between his own shattered life and the desert's sudden, impossible rebirth. 23-year-old Sarah Mitchell gripped the steering wheel of their battered Honda Civic with white knuckles, her hazel eyes straining to see through the windshield that the wipers could no longer keep clear. Beside her, 21-year-old Emma huddled beneath a thin jacket, her auburn hair damp with melted snow that had somehow found its way into their failing vehicle. "I can't see the road anymore," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that seemed determined to tear their car apart. They had been driving for 8 hours straight, fleeing from the nightmare they'd left behind in Phoenix, when the impossible storm had descended upon them like a living thing with malicious intent. Emma pressed her face against the passenger window, trying to find any landmark that might guide them to safety. There has to be something out there, a gas station, a house, anything. Her breath fogged the glass, creating another barrier between them and the hostile world beyond. The sisters had been running for 3 days, carrying nothing but a few clothes, $200 in cash, and the weight of secrets they couldn't share with anyone. Their stepfather's explosive temper had finally crossed a line they couldn't forgive or forget, forcing them to abandon the only home they'd known. Since their mother's remarriage 5 years earlier, the plan had been simple: drive to their aunt's house in Denver, start fresh, leave the bruises and fear behind. The storm had turned their escape route into a potential trap. "The engine's making that noise again," Emma said, her voice tight with worry. The Honda had been protesting for the last 50 miles, its aged components struggling against conditions it was never designed to handle. The heater had stopped working an hour ago, and ice was beginning to form on the inside of the windows despite their body heat. Sarah felt the car shudder as she pressed the accelerator, the wheels spinning uselessly in the accumulated snow. They were no longer following any road she could identify, just steering between what looked like the largest gaps in an increasingly uniform landscape of white. Every direction looked the same now, every landmark erased by the relentless snowfall that seemed to mock their desperate situation. "We should have stayed at that last truck stop," Emma murmured, though they both knew it wouldn't have made a difference. The storm had caught everyone by surprise, including the meteorologists who were still struggling to explain how such extreme weather had developed so rapidly in the desert southwest. The Honda's engine coughed, sputtered, and fell silent. Sarah pumped the accelerator frantically, turned the key multiple times, but nothing happened. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the storm's fury. At least while they were moving, they could tell themselves they were making progress toward safety. Now they were simply two young women alone in a hostile wilderness with night falling and temperatures dropping by the minute. "What do we do now?" Emma asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer was nothing good. Sarah pulled out her phone, hoping against hope for a signal that could connect them to help. The screen showed no bars, no connection to the world they'd left behind. They were as isolated as if they'd been transported to another planet, surrounded by an alien landscape that bore no resemblance to the familiar desert they'd been driving through just hours earlier. "We have to stay with the car," Sarah said, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "Someone will find us when the storm passes. We just have to wait it out." She knew she was lying, no one knew where they were, and their planned route had been deliberately chosen to avoid detection by anyone who might try to force them to return to Phoenix. Emma nodded, but her shivering was becoming more pronounced despite her efforts to control it. They had dressed for Arizona weather, not a blizzard that belonged in Alaska or Montana. Their light jackets were already soaked through, and their shoes were meant for city streets, not trudging through snow that was already knee-deep around their stranded vehicle. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted with ruthless efficiency. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it seemed to be gaining strength, building drifts around their car that threatened to bury them entirely. Sarah tried to keep Emma talking, knowing that silence and sleep could be deadly in their situation. But conversation became increasingly difficult as exhaustion and cold sapped their energy. "Remember when we used to build snow forts at Grandma's house in Colorado?" Emma said through chattering teeth, trying to find warmth in happier memories. "We thought snow was magical then." Sarah managed a weak smile. "We were 8 and 6 years old. Everything seemed magical then." She wrapped her arms around her younger sister, sharing what little body heat she could generate. The irony of their situation wasn't lost on her. They had fled one form of danger only to encounter another that might prove even more deadly. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The car windows were now completely covered with snow, creating a cocoon that might have been comforting if it weren't also a potential tomb. Sarah's watch showed 2:17 a.m., but time had lost its meaning in their white prison. She found herself drifting in and out of a dangerous drowsiness, fighting to stay alert even as her body begged for rest. "Sarah," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so cold I can't feel my toes anymore." Fear shot through Sarah like an electric current. She knew enough about exposure to understand that losing sensation was a bad sign, a warning that their bodies were beginning to shut down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature. They needed help, and they needed it soon. But help seemed as impossible to find as warmth in their frozen refuge. The storm continued its assault throughout the night, piling snow higher around their vehicle until the windows were completely blocked and their world became a cramped, dark space, filled with their own shallow breathing and the muffled sound of wind that never seemed to rest. Sarah tried to keep Emma awake by talking about their plans for Denver, the apartment they would find, the jobs they would get, the normal life they would build together. But her words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Promises that might never have a chance to be fulfilled. As dawn approached, though it was impossible to tell in their buried sanctuary, Both sisters were sliding in and out of consciousness despite their best efforts to stay alert. The cold had become a living thing, creeping through their clothes and into their bones with patient, inexorable determination. Sarah's thoughts were becoming fuzzy, her reactions slow, and she recognized with growing terror that they were losing the battle against the elements. It was then that Emma thought she heard something different. From the endless howling of the wind, a mechanical sound that didn't belong in their natural frozen hell. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, grabbing Sarah's arm with fingers that had lost most of their feeling. Sarah strained to listen, hardly daring to hope. For a moment, there was nothing but the familiar symphony of the storm. Then she heard it too, the distant rumble of an engine, powerful and determined, growing steadily closer to their location. Someone was out there in the blizzard, someone with a vehicle capable of handling conditions that had defeated their Honda hours earlier. The sound grew louder, more distinct, accompanied by what might have been the crunch of snow being displaced by heavy tires. Both sisters pressed themselves against the car windows, trying to clear away enough snow to see outside, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and disbelief. A brilliant light suddenly cut through the white wall surrounding their car, so bright after hours of darkness that it made them both squint and shield their eyes. The light swept back and forth methodically, as if someone was searching for something specific in the vast expanse of unmarked snow. "Help!" Sarah screamed, pounding on the car window with fists that barely registered the impact. "We're here! Help us!" Emma joined her sister's desperate effort, adding her voice to cries that seemed impossibly small against the storm's roar. But the light continued its methodical search, and the engine sound remained steady and strong. Someone was out there, someone with the resources and determination to brave conditions that had claimed their vehicle and nearly claimed their lives. The light suddenly fixed on their location, holding steady for several long seconds that felt like an eternity. Then the engine sound changed, becoming more purposeful, heading directly toward their snow-covered prison. Their rescuer had found them, though they couldn't yet see who had the courage and capability to venture into the storm when everyone else had taken shelter and waited for it to pass. Marcus Harrison had made his decision at 3:42 a.m., staring through his mansion's windows at a landscape that had become completely alien overnight. The storm's fury had awakened something in him that had been dormant for 3 years. Not hope exactly, but something resembling purpose. When his estate's advanced weather monitoring system detected what appeared to be a heat signature approximately 2 miles northwest of his property, he knew he couldn't simply observe from the safety of his fortress any longer. The custom-modified Range Rover Defender had been his one concession to the possibility that his self-imposed exile might require emergency action. Equipped with tracks instead of traditional tires, a reinforced heating system, and GPS navigation that could function in conditions that would defeat ordinary vehicles, it had cost him $300,000 and had never been used for anything more challenging than trips to the secure compound's perimeter. Now, as Marcus maneuvered his wheelchair into the vehicle's specially designed driver's compartment, he wondered if his 3 years of hermit-like existence had prepared him for what might be the most important decision of his new life. The Defender's hand controls responded to his touch with familiar precision, though his heart was beating faster than it had in months. The storm fought him from the moment he left the compound's protected entrance. Snow whipped across the windshield, faster than the heavy-duty wipers could clear it, and the wind seemed determined to push his vehicle off course, despite its weight and advanced stability systems. But Marcus had been a man accustomed to overcoming obstacles through sheer determination, and those instincts hadn't completely atrophied during his years of isolation. The heat signature on his GPS remained steady, approximately where his calculations suggested it would be, though the storm made visual confirmation impossible until he was almost on top of the source. When his powerful searchlights finally cut through the swirling snow to reveal the outline of a buried sedan, Marcus felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. 2 young women were trapped inside that vehicle, and, from the way their car was positioned and the amount of snow that had accumulated around it, they had been there for several hours at least. In conditions like these, Several hours could easily become a sentence worse than prison. Marcus maneuvered his vehicle closer, using the defender's advanced winch system to clear away enough snow to expose the sedan's windows. When he saw their faces pressed against the glass, pale, terrified, but unmistakably alive, something shifted inside him that he hadn't experienced since the accident. These women needed him, not his money or his influence or his business acumen, but him personally. It was a feeling both foreign and achingly familiar, reminiscent of the man he used to be before tragedy had stripped away his sense of agency and purpose, getting them out of their vehicle and into his required, careful coordination. The younger woman, she couldn't have been more than 21, was showing signs of advanced hypothermia, her movements sluggish and her responses delayed. The older sister, clearly the protector of the pair, was in better condition, but still dangerously cold and exhausted from fighting the storm throughout the night. "My name is Marcus," he called through the vehicle's communication system, his voice amplified enough to cut through the wind. "I'm going to get you both out of there, but I need you to stay calm and follow my instructions exactly." The extraction process took 20 minutes that felt like hours. The women, Sarah and Emma, they told him through chattering teeth, were so cold they could barely coordinate their movements, but they followed his directions with the desperation of people who understood they were fighting for their lives. When they were finally secure in the heated passenger compartment of his Defender, wrapped in emergency blankets and breathing warm air for the first time in hours, Marcus felt something resembling satisfaction. The journey back to his compound was treacherous but manageable, with the Defender's advanced systems and Marcus's growing confidence in his ability to handle the crisis. Sarah and Emma were too exhausted and cold to ask many questions during the trip, but he could feel their curiosity about their rescuer, a man who lived in apparent isolation but possessed the resources and determination to venture into a killer storm to save complete strangers. Marcus's mansion, when they finally reached it, seemed to emerge from the white void like something from a dream. The sisters stared in amazement at the modern architectural marvel that had been carved from the desert landscape, with no regard for expense or conventional wisdom. Solar panels and wind generators provided power independent of the grid, while advanced insulation and heating systems maintained comfortable temperatures regardless of external conditions. "Who are you?" Sarah asked as Marcus helped them from the vehicle to the mansion's main entrance, her voice still weak, but gaining strength with each breath of warm air. "Someone who understands what it means to be lost," Marcus replied, though he wasn't sure why he chose those particular words. The truth was more complicated. He was a man who had spent 3 years running from his own past, only to discover that saving others might be the first step towards saving himself. The mansion's interior was as impressive as its exterior, but Marcus found himself seeing it through their eyes, not as the luxurious prison it had become for him, but as a sanctuary that could offer warmth, safety, and time to heal. The guest wing had been unused since his self-imposed exile began, but Mrs. Rodriguez had maintained everything in perfect condition, as if she had always believed he would eventually remember how to open his home to others. Dr. Patricia Walsh, Marcus's longtime physician, arrived within hours despite the continuing storm, traveling in her own specially equipped vehicle to examine the sisters and ensure they hadn't suffered any permanent damage from their exposure. She was one of the few people Marcus still trusted completely, having stood by him throughout the darkest period of his recovery after the accident. "They're going to be fine," Dr. Walsh assured him after completing her examination. "Mild hypothermia, some dehydration, exhaustion, but nothing that rest and warmth won't cure. You got to them in time, Marcus. A few more hours in those conditions, and the outcome would have been very different." Marcus nodded, though he was surprised by how much her words meant to him. When had he started caring about outcomes again? When had the welfare of strangers become important enough to risk his own safety and shatter the protective routine he had built around his isolation? As the sisters settled into the guest wing, Marcus found himself watching them with an intensity that surprised him. Sarah, the older sister, moved with a wariness that spoke of recent trauma, her eyes constantly scanning for exits and threats even in the security of his home. Emma, younger and apparently more trusting, seemed amazed by the mansion's luxury, but also uncomfortable with it, as if she wasn't sure she belonged in such an environment. They were running from something, that much was obvious. The car they'd been driving was at least 10 years old and showed signs of hard use. Their clothes were inexpensive and practical, chosen for function rather than fashion. Most tellingly, they carried no credit cards, no identification that could be easily traced, and they had paid cash for gasoline at every stop of their journey. Marcus recognized the signs because he had been running too in his own way. The difference was that his flight had been from the consequences of his choices, while theirs seemed to be from circumstances beyond their control. There was something in Sarah's protective stance toward her younger sister that reminded him of his own responsibility for the tragedy that had changed his life. But her vigilance seemed born of love rather than guilt. Over the next few days, as the storm gradually weakened and the impossible snow began to melt under the desert sun, the three of them established a careful routine. The sisters were clearly grateful for the rescue and the sanctuary, but they were also wary of their benefactor's motives. Marcus found their caution oddly reassuring. It suggested they were survivors who had learned not to trust easily, a wisdom that might serve them well in whatever they were running from. For his part, Marcus discovered that having others in his home had awakened aspects of his personality that had been dormant for years. He found himself planning meals with Mrs. Rodriguez, ensuring that the guest wing was comfortable, even arranging for clothing to be delivered since the sisters had lost most of their possessions when their car was buried in the storm. But beneath the surface courtesies and practical arrangements, deeper currents were beginning to flow. Marcus could see that Sarah and Emma were evaluating him just as carefully as he was observing them, trying to understand what kind of man lived in such isolation and possessed the resources to mount a rescue operation in impossible conditions. Their questions were polite but probing, their gratitude genuine but cautious. The truth was that Marcus wasn't entirely sure himself what kind of man he had become, or what kind of man he might yet become. The rescue had awakened something in him that felt both familiar and entirely new, a sense of agency and purpose that he hadn't experienced since before the accident that had changed everything. But with that awakening came questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer, about his past, his choices, and the reasons why he had chosen exile over engagement with the world he had once commanded. 3 weeks after the storm, Marcus found Sarah sitting alone on the mansion's main terrace, watching the desert sunrise paint the recovered landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The impossible snow had melted completely, leaving behind a desert that seemed more alive than before, dotted with wildflowers that had sprouted from seeds lying dormant for decades, waiting for the perfect combination of moisture and temperature to finally bloom. Couldn't sleep either, Marcus asked as he wheeled onto the terrace, carrying 2 cups of coffee on a tray attached to his chair. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. I keep thinking about what we would have done if you hadn't found us that night. Emma and I have been running for so long we forgot what it felt like to be somewhere safe. Marcus studied her profile as she spoke, noting the way tension still held her shoulders rigid, despite 3 weeks of security and comfort. You don't have to tell me what you're running from, but you should know that you're welcome to stay, as long as you need to figure out what comes next. That's incredibly generous, Sarah said, finally turning to meet his eyes. But we both know you didn't rescue us just to have house guests. There's something you need too, isn't there? Her directness caught Marcus off guard, though he realized he should have expected it. Sarah Mitchell was clearly a young woman who had learned to read people and situations with the accuracy that came from having survival depend on those skills. She had been watching him just as carefully as he had been watching her, and she had reached conclusions that might be uncomfortably accurate. Maybe, Marcus admitted. I've been alone here for 3 years, telling myself it was what I wanted. But when I saw your car buried in that storm, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my accident. Purpose, I suppose. A reason to act instead of just existing. Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, drawn by the sound of their conversation. At 21, she was beginning to show signs of the confidence that came from 3 weeks of regular meals, safety, and her sister's gradually decreasing hypervigilance. Are you two having one of those serious conversations that means our weird little family is about to change? Marcus smiled at her description. A weird little family. It was more accurate than he would have expected when he first brought them home from the storm. Over the past 3 weeks, they had settled into routines that felt surprisingly natural. Emma had discovered his library and was working her way through biographies of successful women, while Sarah had shown an unexpected talent for helping Mrs. Rodriguez manage the household's increasingly complex needs. Maybe it's time I told you both why I was out here alone in the first place, Marcus said, making a decision that had been building for days. And why finding you might have saved me as much as I saved you. The story came slowly, in pieces that Marcus had never shared with anyone except Dr. Walsh and his lawyers. 3 years earlier, he had been Marcus Harrison, the 35-year-old CEO of Harrison Industries, a renewable energy company that he had built from a college dorm room idea into a billion-dollar enterprise. He had been engaged to Catherine Morrison, a successful attorney who shared his passion for environmental conservation and social justice. The accident had happened on a Saturday morning in October. Marcus had been driving to meet Catherine at their favorite hiking trail in the mountains outside Las Vegas, planning to propose to her at the summit, where they had shared their first kiss 2 years earlier. He never made it to the trail. A drunk driver had run a red light at 60 miles per hour, turning Marcus's Tesla into twisted metal and changing his life forever. Catherine stayed with me through the first year of recovery, Marcus continued, his voice steady but distant. She said all the right things about our future together, about adapting to new circumstances. But I could see the truth in her eyes. She had fallen in love with a man who climbed mountains and ran companies and changed the world through sheer force of will. The man in the wheelchair wasn't the same person. Sarah and Emma listened in silence as Marcus explained how he had ended the relationship himself, convinced that Catherine deserved better than a future shadowed by his limitations. He had sold Harrison Industries to his biggest competitor, liquidated most of his assets, and retreated to the Nevada desert with enough money to live comfortably for several lifetimes and no plan for how to fill the years ahead. I told myself I was sparing everyone the burden of my changed circumstances, Marcus said. But the truth was I was afraid of failing at something that mattered, afraid of being seen as less than I used to be, afraid of building something new that might not measure up to what I had lost. Emma, who had been growing more animated throughout his story, suddenly stood up and walked to where Marcus sat. Without asking permission, she wrapped her arms around his shoulders in a fierce hug that caught him completely off guard. "You saved our lives," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not because you were the man you used to be, but because you were exactly the man you are now. Someone who saw people in trouble and decided their safety was more important than his own comfort." Sarah joined her sister, placing a gentle hand on Marcus's arm. "Emma's right. We've been staying here for 3 weeks, and in that time you've shown us more kindness and consideration than most people manage in a lifetime. Whatever you think you lost in that accident, it wasn't the part of you that matters most." 4. The first time in 3 years, Marcus felt tears on his cheeks. Not the bitter tears of loss and self-pity that had marked his early recovery, but something cleaner and more hopeful. These young women, who had every reason to be focused on their own survival and future, had instead chosen to see him clearly and accept what they found without judgment or pity. The conversation that followed stretched through the morning and into the afternoon, as all three of them shared pieces of their stories that had been too painful or complicated to reveal earlier. Sarah and Emma told him about their mother's second marriage to a man whose charm had hidden an explosive temper, about years of walking on eggshells and protecting each other from emotional abuse that had finally escalated to physical violence. "We left the night he hit Emma," Sarah said, her voice matter-of-fact but her eyes fierce. "I had promised our mother before she passed that I would always protect my sister, and I realized that staying was breaking that promise." Marcus understood their wariness now, their careful way of evaluating his motives and maintaining their independence even while accepting his help. They had learned not to trust charm or generosity that might come with hidden costs, and their gradual acceptance of his genuine concern was a gift he hadn't expected to receive. As the weeks turned into months, their unusual household found its rhythm. Emma enrolled in online college courses, pursuing the education that her family's financial struggles had previously made impossible. Sarah discovered a talent for managing Marcus's charitable foundation, bringing an organizational expertise that helped him direct his wealth toward causes that actually made a difference in people's lives. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself re-entering the world in small but meaningful ways. He began consulting with renewable energy startups, using his experience and connections to help young entrepreneurs avoid the mistakes he had made. He started taking the physical therapy sessions with Dr. Walsh more seriously, working to regain strength and mobility he hadn't bothered to pursue during his years of self-imposed isolation. The revelation that changed everything came 6 months after the storm, when Sarah finally received a call from their aunt in Denver. The sister's stepfather had been arrested for tax evasion and was facing federal charges that would likely result in years in prison. The man they had fled from was no longer a threat, but the news brought unexpected complications. "We could go home," Emma said during one of their evening conversations on the terrace. Not to him, obviously, but to Phoenix. "We have friends there, connections, a life we built before everything went wrong." Marcus felt his chest tighten at the thought of their leaving, but he kept his expression neutral. "Is that what you want to do?" Sarah and Emma exchanged a look that held entire conversations Marcus wasn't privy to. Finally, Sarah spoke for both of them. "We want to stay if you'll have us, not as charity cases or house guests, but as partners. Emma wants to finish her degree, and I want to help you rebuild Harrison Industries as something even better than it was before." "Partners," Marcus repeated, testing the word. It had been so long since he had considered any relationship that implied equality and mutual benefit, rather than obligation or pity. "Partners," Sarah confirmed. "You saved our lives, but we think we might be able to help save yours too." Marcus looked out over the desert landscape where impossible snow had once fallen, creating conditions that had brought them all together. The wildflowers that had bloomed after the storm were still thriving, adding color to a landscape that had seemed permanently barren. Perhaps some transformations were meant to be permanent, some changes written in the very fabric of the land itself. 2 years later, Marcus stood at the podium of the Las Vegas Convention Center, addressing a crowd of renewable energy investors and entrepreneurs who had gathered for the inaugural Harrison Foundation Innovation Summit. His speech was being live-streamed to thousands of viewers around the world, but his eyes kept finding Sarah and Emma in the front row, their proud smiles giving him the confidence to share his story with an audience that might judge him for his years of retreat. 3 years ago, I thought my story was over," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "I had lost what I thought defined me, and I convinced myself that meant I had nothing left to offer the world. It took a freak snowstorm in the Nevada desert and 2 remarkable young women to teach me that our greatest contributions often come not from our strengths, but from our willingness to act in spite of our limitations." The Harrison Foundation had grown from Marcus's tentative first steps back into the world into something neither he nor the Mitchell sisters had originally envisioned. What had started as a way to channel his wealth toward meaningful causes had evolved into a comprehensive support network for young entrepreneurs, particularly women and minorities who faced systemic barriers in accessing capital and mentorship. Sarah had proven to have an extraordinary talent for identifying promising startups and helping them navigate the complex world of venture capital and regulatory compliance. Her own experience with survival and adaptation had given her insights into which businesses were likely to thrive under pressure and which founders had the resilience to overcome inevitable obstacles. Emma, now 23 and graduating SUMA, Cum laude with degrees in both environmental science and business administration, had become the Foundation's youngest program director, overseeing initiatives that combined technological innovation with social impact. Her natural optimism and fresh perspective had attracted young innovators who might have been intimidated by more traditional funding sources. But the most significant transformation had been Marcus's own evolution from the bitter, isolated man who had watched the first snowflakes fall from his mansion windows. The accident had taken his legs, but his years of self-imposed exile had nearly cost him something more precious: his sense of connection to the larger human story of struggle, hope, and mutual support. The night I drove into that blizzard to rescue two strangers, Marcus continued his speech, I thought I was saving them. What I discovered was that they were saving me. Not from the storm, but from the smaller, sadder life I had chosen when I convinced myself that my value as a human being was tied to my physical capabilities rather than my capacity for courage, compassion, and contribution. The audience erupted in sustained applause, but Marcus barely heard it. His attention was focused on Sarah and Emma, who were wiping tears from their eyes while simultaneously beaming with pride. They had become the family he had never expected to find, partners in the truest sense of the word, collaborators in building something meaningful from the wreckage of their separate tragedies. The Foundation's success had exceeded all their expectations. In 2 years, they had funded 47 startups, created over 3,000 jobs, and pioneered innovative approaches to combining profit with social responsibility. More importantly, they had created a model that other wealthy individuals were beginning to emulate, demonstrating that isolation and self-pity were poor uses of resources that could instead be channeled toward healing and hope. After the conference, the three of them returned to the Nevada estate that had become their shared headquarters and home. The mansion that had once been Marcus's fortress against the world was now a bustling center of activity, with guest rooms frequently occupied by entrepreneurs, researchers, and social activists who had come to collaborate on projects that might change the world in small but meaningful ways. Do you ever think about what would have happened if that storm hadn't come? Emma asked as they sat together on the terrace where so many of their important conversations had taken place. Marcus considered the question seriously. I think we all would have found our way eventually, just perhaps not together. You and Sarah have too much strength and intelligence to have stayed lost forever, and I was too stubborn to give up completely, even if it took me longer to remember that. Sarah raised her wine glass in a toast that had become their ritual. To impossible storms and unexpected rescues. To partnerships that save everyone involved, Emma added, clinking her glass against her sister's. Marcus completed the toast with words that still amazed him every time he spoke them. To families we choose and futures we build together. As the desert sunset painted the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The storm that had seemed like a catastrophe had actually been a gift, creating conditions that allowed three lost souls to find each other and discover that salvation rarely comes in the form we expect. The wildflowers that had bloomed after the impossible snow were still thriving in their third season, a reminder that some changes really were permanent, some transformations written into the very DNA of the landscape. Like the desert itself, they had learned to bloom in conditions that had once seemed hostile to life, finding beauty and purpose in circumstances that might have destroyed less resilient spirits. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that Marcus, Sarah and Emma's story has moved you as much as it moved us while creating it. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories that explore themes of redemption, unexpected family bonds, and the transformative power of choosing courage over comfort. You can find it by clicking the link to your left. If you enjoyed this story of how a desert snowstorm brought three broken souls together to create something beautiful, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the surprising ways that our greatest challenges can become our most meaningful opportunities. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we look forward to seeing you in the comments sharing your own thoughts about second chances, chosen families, and the courage it takes to save others.